Hi everyone, I'm Lila from Hands Up Mallee, and as always, I'm grateful to be included in today's webinar and the broader work exploring the role of story in systems change with the Centre for Public Impact and Dusseldorf Forum. I want to welcome everyone who is joining us now and those who will join us across time through today's recording. I'd like to recognise that many of you may be coming from other countries and time zones, and to acknowledge the work we have done leading to this session is connected to the context of place. Much of this work is grounded in an Australian context, and because of this, it's important to be mindful that what you take away from today might need to be connected to the context of your place. Place and connection play a vital role in the power of story. In connection with that understanding, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where we live, connect, and create our stories. For myself, that is the land of the Latchi Latchi people and our near neighbours, the Barkinji. I also want to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the First Peoples of the lands you're all joining us from today. I want to share with that acknowledging their deep and long connections with country and story is just one step in the work, and to be meaningful, it must connect with our greater efforts towards reconciliation. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks so much, Lila. Hi, everyone. My name is Asitha, and I'm from the Centre for Public Impact. I'd like to welcome you all as well. Before we dive into the panel discussion, recognising that we've got many people joining us from around the world, and many of us who will be listening in to the recording afterwards as well. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to provide some context. And we also had, as part of Centre for Public Impact's Story Week, a webinar last week from the Asia region, participatory storytelling in complex systems, and some of you may be joining us today as well, so welcome to everyone. As some brief context, in 2022, Dusseldorf Forum, Hands Up Mallee, and the Centre for Public Impact came together to deepen our understanding of how stories of those engaging in systems change could be better supported by having their stories heard and told. As part of this phase of the research, we were starting to understand that the energy in this field was focused on how to craft and tell better stories, or the supply side of the equation, and far less attention is being paid to how to create an audience who wants to listen to stories, or the demand side. So we came together again this year to understand what the conditions are and how to create the conditions to where stories are heard and listened to. And as part of this process, we spoke to a wide range of people across government, philanthropy, and academia. And we heard a range of really interesting perspectives, and we learned so much. And this report that we've launched, which I hope you've all had a chance to dive into, explores a few key themes. A couple of those are how stories are currently used by government and philanthropy, what gets in the way of stories being listened to and understood, and the third one is what might be done to build the readiness of government and philanthropy to listen more deeply. And we've also heard that stories can take many forms. They're not just written and read. So in light of that, we've also created some sketching videos around these key themes. And I'd love to take a minute to share one before we dive into the panel discussion. And a big shout out to Imogen Baker and Kirsten Mogeline for their efforts in producing these. So if you give me 2 seconds, I'll now share my screen with this video.
They are a mode of communication and thinking and connecting. How I use stories. Yeah, I would use that language. I don't use stories. The stories don't allow themselves to be used. They're almost like living things, really. They are a mode of communication and thinking and connecting. And they're something that all human beings, well, most human beings, have been relying on for who knows how many thousands of years. They're part of human society and families and groups and organizations and everything.
Well, storytelling for me has always been the way that we share data. So, you know, when we talk about data, I know for me that I do the work that I do, and I do it in the way that I do it because I've heard the stories of thousands of Aboriginal young people.
Stories help illuminate things that can be difficult or complex to understand.
I think that stories can be very valuable, both in terms of kind of influencing people, but also helping people to see the bigger picture.
There is such wisdom in communities that can be elevated, that can be built on, that can be used to change those outcomes.
All the evidence, all the research says that when you listen to the voices of people who are experiencing these things, you're going to have different solutions, come up with different solutions and different ways of improving outcomes for them. And without stories, it is impossible to capture those voices as well.
One voice will not make a difference. You need mass voices to make a difference, which means we need to have techniques at scale.
Storytelling in the context of negative events, that storytelling can perform a very important and long, I would argue, undervalued function of coping, helping people cope, helping systems cope with, you know, very disruptive, emotionally taxing, sometimes physically taxing experiences. On the other side of the continuum, storytelling can be very important in the context of positive events. You know, pockets of achievement, pockets of pride. And there I think it can have a liberating and more emancipatory function.
The other things that we don't need to have the answers at the beginning. We just need to start and work it as we go. And that's part of what using stories and actually just working with people in relationship looks like.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And yes, we're seeing a couple of comments about the link for these videos. We've actually got 2 more, and we'll pop those links in throughout this webinar. And with that, I'll hand over to Thea Snow.
Thanks so much, Az. And good morning, everyone. I'm Thea Snow with the Centre for Public Impact. And it's been such a delight to work on this project in partnership with Dusseldorp Forum and Hands Up Mallee as part of our second phase of work. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining today from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to elders past and present. As we say in the report, both of our reports, and as we'll touch on today through our conversation, the perspective and wisdom that First Nations people hold in relation to storytelling is so critical and so fundamental to our understanding in this place of what storytelling means and what possibilities it holds. So I want to acknowledge that as I acknowledge where I stand and join you from today as well. So we're about to move into a panel conversation with some of the voices that you just heard in those videos, actually, because the way that we sort of assembled this report was by speaking to lots of different people and understanding from their perspective the role that stories play in their work, and how to create the conditions, as Asitha just mentioned, to have those stories heard and listened to and understood. And so we've got 3 people here today from sort of different parts of the system with different perspectives who I'm going to be in conversation with for about half an hour. And then we're going to make time and space for you to ask questions as well, the audience. So you can do that either in the chat or via the Q&A function. Either works well for us. So we'll be in conversation for about half an hour, but don't feel like you need to sort of bank your questions till the end. Feel free to keep them rolling as we talk, and then I'll come back and pick them up afterwards. So I'm so excited to introduce you to our 3 panelists today. We've got Daniel Daylight, who's joining us from Just Reinvest, Mount Druitt. Daniel is a proud Gamilaroi man who has family ties to the Gubbi Gubbi Nation. Daniel has a passion for helping Aboriginal children and youth who are caught in the criminal justice system and has spent most of his working life in the justice sector. Daniel is currently manager for Just Reinvest New South Wales in Mount Druitt, and he's also a director of the Redfern Aboriginal Medical Service Board and a lifelong member of that organisation. We also have with us today John King from SEER Data and Analytics. John has been the Chief Data Officer at SEER Data since mid-2023. And the reason that John's in that role is because he believes that the path to social impact requires data to be in the hands of communities. Before John joined SEER, he was in the public sector for about 15 years. And in his last role, he led the data analytics and evaluation functions for both the Victorian Department of Health and the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing in Victoria. So quite a huge role that he sort of left the public service quite recently from. And John will be drawing on both his public sector experience and his experience from SEER Data and Analytics as well. And last but definitely not least, we've got Robin Scott joining us from J.R. Mackenzie Trust, which is based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Robin has been the Executive Director of J.R. Mackenzie Trust since May 2017 and has held a number of senior roles, again, both in government and the philanthropic sector. So Robin was the Director of the Ministry of Youth Development and also the CEO of Philanthropy New Zealand. So brings a wealth of experience to the conversation as well. So I want to begin by asking our panelists to tell a story, because we're in a storytelling webinar, a story listening webinar. And what I'd love to hear is a story about you that explains your connection to the theme of sort of stories and story listening. So John, I might pass to you first to share your story with us.
Hi Thea, hi everyone. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri land, also known as heart of Melbourne, the eastern suburbs. I learned how to listen as a lifeline counsellor and trainer. So for those who are joining us from overseas, that's a crisis counselling service. And I volunteered for a number of years right at the start of my career, and it left just such a deep impression. So, I listened to stories about people in crisis, deep crisis, with complex, messy lives, who often felt they had nobody else who could hear them. And those stories have stayed with me throughout my career. I felt this kind of enduring tension between the people and their stories and the structures and silos and constraints of the public sector. And they have acted as my inspiration, I guess, for service and reminders against siloed, shallow thinking. My story. Back to you, Thea.
Thanks, John. That's great. And Robin, I might pass to you now to tell your story about how you have landed in this place with this curiosity about the role of stories and story listening in your work.
Tēnā koutou katoa, kia ora. Lovely to meet and see you all from all around the world. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I'm based. My connection with stories, like most people's, is both personal and professional. Professionally, at the J.R. Mackenzie Trust, we hope that we are able to support organisations to amplify stories and amplify their stories of change, and support ways that those stories can sometimes be in mainstream media, which may not support their version, people's version of stories. My personal connection with stories was in my leadership of a small health-based advocacy organisation for quite some time, both in a volunteer capacity and a professional capacity, where we were able to use stories of the impact of policies for policy makers, particularly for ministers in the government, who had been fed quite a diet of data, which showed very little about the real impact of policies, particularly on rationing in the public health sector, rationing of a particular type of service. So like most people, I have both a professional and a private interest in the power of storytelling. Thanks, Thea.
Thanks, Robin. And this is a bit stilted, this bit, where I'm asking each panelist to sort of tell their own story, but we will try to move more into sort of a conversational style approach after this. And so, as I said, if you've got questions or things that are coming up for you from an audience perspective, feel free to start popping those in the chat, and I can weave those in as we go as well. But Daniel, before we do that, I'd love to hear your story So I'll hand to you.
Yeah, sorry, my computer's been weird. Yeah, so first I acknowledge I'm coming from Bidyagal land here, and I'm kind of Western Sydney. In my stories, I think as Aboriginal person, stories and storytelling are a big part of our culture and our law and stuff like that. And so you grow up with it. In the kind of professional context, I suppose, which is mentioned in the report, is the stories of Mounty Yarns, which we worked on or I've worked on for the last 3 years. And so for that kind of, you saw in that video that played just before that, I talked about like, you know, my expertise just comes from talking to thousands of Aboriginal kids going through the justice system. And on the flip side to that, when you start working in the community sector, I suppose, or when you actually, because that was with the government, when you actually start going to like a community organisation and you need to try and get money, people often want people to share their stories, their success stories. Do you have a good news story? Do you have this? And that kind of always didn't sit well with me. I was always protective of our young people because I understood from those talking to that thousands of young people that even though each story was unique, each story was interconnected, and particularly from a place like Mount Druitt in Western Sydney. So we got together and with a group of young people who led that project, were able to gather over 100 stories from different young people in the area that were interconnected into a document that's in the report. So forming that kind of collective storytelling, even though it was all individual and it's, you know, no one de-identified. So I'm able to sleep at night. So stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's the power of storytelling. You know, that was a long process, 3 years, and we're still going on with that. But yeah, maybe we'll talk about it more later. But I suppose that's the biggest thing with storytelling, and we've had very good feedback on that, and it shows that we didn't have to kind of trot out a young Aboriginal person to share their trauma. We could kind of come up with a way around doing that that still is just as powerful.
That's great. Thank you, Daniel. And I did warn our panelists that I might go off script. I don't think they anticipated that I'd do it for the very first question, but I'm going to, because something that's just sort of struck me as you've all been talking is that, you know, John, you spoke about your experience with stories, with people calling lifelines. So people at a really vulnerable moment in their lives. Daniel, you spoke about using stories for, you know, young people who have engaged in the justice system. And Robin, you sort of alluded to the fact that sometimes what you're trying to do is bring the voices of people whose voices wouldn't otherwise be heard into mainstream media. So what I heard, the thread that I heard across all of your introductions was sort of using stories as a way of sort of rebalancing power almost. You know, people who in society are not in positions of power. And so that was definitely one of the themes that sort of came up in the report, and particularly the relationship between sort of data, which I think is, you know, a language that people in power speak easily and understand, and stories, which seem to be a language and a way into communities and cohorts of people who may not feel that they hold that power. And I'd love to explore that a little bit more, the relationship between data and stories and power as well, and how that plays into it. So, John, I might throw to you to sort of lead off with that question, if that's okay.
Yeah, okay, Thea. So I might start off with a bit of a story as well. When I started the public service, naive, I'm at Lifeline, I'm working at a big social policy department. What I found was social policy, the arguments that I was trying to make just weren't being listened to. We kept getting rolled by the economists, infrastructure. They had stronger arguments. We would often come with, I guess, what we've dismissed as moral ones, equity ones. and we would never win the debates. We would never get the money, exaggerating a little bit. And so a big part of the arc of my career has been trying to rebalance that dynamic and trying to use data to help with that. And so, for example, being able to make quantitative arguments about the benefits, Daniel, of keeping kids out of justice. Here is a picture with the data on what these kids are going through. Here is the evidence about the benefits that might come if they don't. And again, those benefits in terms that make sense to those in power. Could be dollars saved or dollars avoided. But there's real downside risk with that. And I think I just want to pick up on something you said there, which was that data is something that people in power speak easily and understand, I think was your words. I'm not so sure. I think there's trust, and I think sometimes there's trust that's blind. And so that's my perspective. I've seen social policy start to be rebalanced so that it's now on a more equal footing with some other domains, but real downside in over-reliance on data and forgetting that richness and thickness, I guess, that comes from storytelling. So really interested in throwing that out there and getting your perspectives on that, Robin, Daniel.
Thanks, John. Yeah, we perhaps are starting to move back into an environment in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we're going to be moving back into data, and data being occupying the principal place of influence with a new government that's talking back a lot around monetising, understanding the monetary value of things through a social return on investment approach to things. Sometimes these shifts like this mean I think those of us in the philanthropic sector need to gather together with our community and voluntary sector colleagues to understand the needs around rebalancing some of this information. One of the ways that the J.R. Mackenzie Trust has in the past supported ngā kaikōkiri, or that's the term that those around the world might call grantees, so leaders and organisations. One of the things we have done is support a media company that is able to get placement in mainstream media for those for whom stories are often quite unbalanced and may be able to present stories of change, of upstream change in quite a different way into a mainstream audience, knowing that there are quite a few people who now get your information from mainstream media, appreciating that sometimes it's also from other types of media these days. But that's one of the ways we've been able to help rebalancing public media, I suppose, in a way, is to support those organisations who do want to tell their stories, and it is their story. We respect that. It's just an opportunity that we offer to get placement, particularly into mainstream visual media, as a kind of a way of rebalancing a diet of negativity that is often found around particular groups in mainstream media.
Yeah, I'll probably be short there. So it was like one of the things that actually when I read in the report was there was like a quote there that, you know, data informs and stories inspire, and that really doesn't sit with me because stories are the things that really inform because they have the nuances, and often a lot of the data that comes into the system, say from a criminal justice system, is inherently racist because of the people who are putting the data in and the systems that are putting that data in. So it doesn't tell the true story, whereas stories often will tell that better. We had a recent example where through Mauni Yarns, we were able to get Boxer to do a data set from the Mauni Yarns report. And from that, we were able to actually go back to, well, it'll happen tomorrow, but we're able to go back to the police and say, what you've been saying for years isn't true. We now have the data, from your own data. So that was having that stories there, and then the data just kind of fits in with our narrative. and not because we made it that way. It was just that we were able to ask for the data that we wanted, and that wasn't the data that was given to us. So I think that that's that Indigenous data sovereignty stuff that happens around Indigenous communities around the world, I suppose. But yeah, so I think that, you know, there's always got to be that pushback, because I think the systems that capture that data, well, especially in our country here, I can't speak for anywhere else, but in our country here, those systems are inherently racist, and so that data is inherently racist too.
That's a really interesting point, Daniel. And I'd love John to throw back to you, as someone who worked in data in government for many years, to share your thoughts about what Daniel just shared.
Daniel's right. Like I agree, and the data has many other limitations besides, but that one he mentioned is incredibly difficult. And yet in government, we're still asked and do our best to work with the data despite those limitations. And I, for one, am fully supportive, as I think the state I'm in, Victoria, is as well, of moving towards Indigenous data sovereignty and starting to address the sort of years of collection bias that Daniel's talking about. I still would suggest that we can, if we are careful, draw conclusions or use data. And what Daniel suggested is a great way of doing it, a story-first approach. So you start with story and test with data, rather than often the reverse. You come up with data and then look to backfill it, thicken with story, because then you end up just proving what you want. So like there, I agree, we still have to try and make progress, and we do that in just opening our books, talking to people who know the data, how it's collected, what can we say, what can't we say, how much do we have to caveat. And that's where it gets difficult, right? Because we have decision makers who are looking for often simple answers, 5 dot points or less. And so how do we tell nuance, especially with data where they just want a number? Just tell me the number. What's the saving if we keep these kids out of justice? That's a really difficult part with data, is actually explaining nuance and complexity and limitations and bias.
Thanks, John. And I think I'd love to pick up on something else that came up in the report now as well, which is in the importance of not valorising stories either. So just as we've recognised the limitations of data, one of the ideas that came out in the report was the fact that sort of someone spoke about the danger of a single story. And when I worked in government, I saw that happen, where, you know, we prepared all of this really rigorous analysis about a particular policy area, presented it to the minister, and the minister said, well, my mate's son told me, you know, and you see all this work being derailed by an anecdote. So I'd love to sort of pull on that thread as well and explore the idea of, you know, sort of stories being either, you know, used in way, like one story carrying too much weight, or we've also seen in politics, in all sorts of contexts at the moment, the power of telling a particular story that can really rile people up in dangerous ways as well, because of the emotional connection that people have to stories. So I'd love a bit of a conversation about that as well.
And so when I joined the public sector, and I'll tell you these stories and you're probably wondering, gosh, why did you stay so long? But anyway, when I joined the public sector, the unit that I worked in, the head of it got to sit at the cabinet table and hear the discussion on social policy. And I can't tell you how often the debrief would come back, would say, like, winning the argument was an anecdote from one of the politicians sitting around the table, quite well-known treasurer at the time, whose grandmother was quite involved with social policy. And they, much to our just continual frustration, were often the arguments that used to win. And, you know, policy by anecdote is just, I think, just as big a risk as the heroic use of data, and just being able to, I think, like Daniel's talked like well about this, how to use like large numbers of stories and thematic analysis and do it properly. But yeah, policy by anecdote has a long history. Robin, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm reminded of a slide or a picture I used to have on a wall in a previous office that said the plural of anecdote isn't research or data. And it's a good thing to remember, I think, for all of us. And yes, it sometimes just takes one story to either support or not support something that you're putting forward in the public sector. I think one of the biggest challenges is the desire constantly for a silver bullet, a single answer, a single data point or a single point of reference to solve something that is actually quite complex. And it's figuring out how you unpack some of that drive for the single answer to everything, including justice reform, most especially. So figuring out how you get away from just having that silver bullet answer to everything, which doesn't rely on one story or one data point. To your point, Daniel, the point around data sovereignty is incredibly important, and I think incredibly important for Māori in New Zealand, the data sovereignty. Who owns the data? Who's telling the story? Who owns it effectively? And who has the right actually to speak it or tell it? I think that's a really important thing to remember in this discussion.
Yeah, no, like I suppose to me there's a difference between an anecdote and a story to a degree, but I think that what we focused on with Mountain Yarns was collective storytelling, and it wasn't. It's everyone's just kind of a character in a wider kind of collective. So, and each part of that is still very important, but I think that that then kind of can go around some of the other stuff, because people, not just the anecdotes, but there is people that, like if your story fits the narrative, then even if it's a lived experience story, that person is often the person trotted out to talk about things, to greenlight government things. It's not really always the story of everyone. Like it could be, there's people who do CBT, in custody, and so they get on the huge proponents of CBT, which can be really successful, but other people don't like that kind of therapy, but because that's the thing that helped them, they're advocating for that, and it's just, I think that there is power in doing it as a collective. More so than those individuals, because the individual stories can be, you can cherry pick which ones you want to use.
Thea, one of the things that we at the J.R. Mackenzie Trust were able to support a couple of years ago was something called, I think it was called the People's Voice Symposium, where the public sector was invited to come and listen to people from our community in the area where I live, in Whanganui-a-Tara in Wellington, where I sat at a table with young people from Treasury, our Treasury Department, who were they were all policy people. They all had great brains, but they were astonished by the stories of the real life lived experience that they were having to sit and listen to without being asked to develop a policy, without being asked to comment, but to actually listen and be present in it. And the forum was an incredibly powerful way. Many public sector, from various levels of the public sector, came to that symposium and heard real life stories. I'm not sure the impact that had on policy downstream, but it was certainly very impactful. The people I was sitting with was well outside their life experience. And so those stories together formed something really important around a narrative around listening to inform public policy.
Thanks, Robert. And that's a really wonderful segue into the next question that I wanted to ask, and then we'll move into some audience questions, which is around listening and creating the conditions for listening, because that was really the theme of this report. And one of the things that we sort of explore is like, what does it take? How do we build the readiness of people in government and philanthropy to do what you just said, Robin? What are the barriers that get in the way of that? And how do we sort of support people to be in places that they aren't normally necessarily, where they don't normally necessarily find themselves, and to be ready and able to listen to those stories in ways that perhaps they don't normally do.
I'll go first this time to save John. I think that the thing with that is that it's about trust. So I can only kind of speak from, my experience as an Aboriginal person here in New South Wales, but it's about building trust, because communities, and I suppose John could speak to this, is oftentimes a government will have a new policy, government will have a new procedure that they want to try out, and they come to communities, put on a breakfast or a morning tea, talk to us, go away, and then don't really ever listen. So a lot of that, there is no trust there, because for many, many years, nothing's changed in the community and no one's really been listened to. So to just then walk in and say, no, this time we truly have changed and we're going to listen, it's not going to work. So that's going to take years, and building up trust and building up capacity of community members, because it's community members in those communities that will be your gateway into the other community members. So for us with Mounty Yarns, that process started many years before. In 2018, we got our first youth ambassadors in Mount Druitt. 2019, we got Talia, another youth ambassador. And then it was them that started leading Mounty Yarns in 2020, and are still working with us. But they then had the trust of their peers and the trust of their community, and were able to bring them into the fold to tell our stories. And the other thing I can speak from our perspective here is, it's not just that things don't happen. It's if you share your stories, it's also that really bad things have happened to people who shared their stories. So around, women who experience domestic violence are getting their kids taken, and other things like that happens day to day. That means that if you're someone else that comes in from outside community, you walk in and you expect to hear what's going on, it's just not going to happen, because that trust is well and truly broken. So we got to spend time and effort to build that up.
I agree with trust as fundamental, and openness. Government often works in secrecy and with speed, with resources like data and tools that only it can use. So budget processes, cabinet processes, they're all locked and secret. And Daniel's right, too often stakeholder consultation is something tacked on at the end, and it erodes rather than builds. And there are of course exceptions, great ones, both government-led and external, where we've done things well. The norm, though, is secret and separate. And I mean, in part, that's why I'm here with See Data, is to get data out and sovereign in communities to start addressing that balance. And I've got huge belief in place-based, community-led decision-making as the antidote. And the fundamental thing for that is trust, as Daniel said. How do we create those conditions? And I loved Robin's example of, I'm going to take it as putting public servants in a room to listen, because too often we don't want to be in rooms, or we're in rooms with an expectation to act, and that can obscure listening. And so I feel like that's why Lifeline and counselling had such a deep impression on me. Is I was there to listen, to understand. I wasn't there to solve problems. It's the first step in creating those trust conditions.
I support both what you've said, both Daniel and John, and what you've said, creating the conditions for this. And I think trust, openness, willingness to listen. And I think whether it's in government or non-government organisations, you need leadership for culture change. You need leadership around leading people to validate and value the community-led experience to inform culture and to inform policy. So I think there is leadership required around it. That we have a fabulous organisation in Aotearoa, New Zealand, called Inspiring Communities, that work at the community-based level and have managed to build trust with with government agencies and others. And I think the trust building exercise can't be underestimated. The work that was done at the People's Voice Symposium was led by an organisation that is trusted by government. So I think trust is really, really critical, but so is leadership around cultural change and valuing what the community has to say about particular issues and not simply paying lip service to it. I think they're really important ingredients in that cake.
Thanks. That's a fantastic, and also feels like a nice segue into our first question, which was Jane Anderson, who says that storytelling can take time, both the story and both the listening and the telling. And do you have any suggestions for how we can encourage people to invest time in this process?
I'll go again. I think that both that goes with trust and storytelling. It's the same thing. That often things take time, and to John's point, that government doesn't appreciate that sometimes, and it's a product of the system that's created. That it's like a new government comes in, we've got to do this. But for storytelling to work with people who come from a lot of trauma and people who come from, communities that are living with intergenerational trauma, that takes time because the trust takes time, but then the little bits of stories take time. And it's also like, we've talked about this before, but like, intergenerational trauma is going to need intergenerational healing, and it's going to take time. So those stories, and if we view it as a collective and not as just an individual, those stories might take generations. It might be more, I don't know, like a Lord of the Rings kind of series than it is like a little, alchemist type of book. But these things might take time, might take many different books, but if those stories have depth, and those stories are the ones that have stood the test of time, and for us, these stories are not going away. Is the other thing. Like, we come from 100,000 years of storytelling here in this country. It's just to the point of this. It's actually sitting down and listening to those stories is the thing. So. Yeah, I think it's going to take time, but like, we've got to appreciate that it'll take time and fund things in a way that understands that these things will take time. Yeah. Anyways, I'll stop there.
I agree with the problem. Firstly, in government, the kind of cult of busyness and efficiency just gets in the way. I think, like, my strong advice to public servants out there is get out and do whatever you can to slow down. And so we would use, in my last job, evaluations, which we had some control over with pace and method, to try and slow down and use ways that would enable people to listen. Although with the risk, I think that the report talks about still of power dynamics in those sort of processes. So it's still not perfect. And if you can't do it in your day jobs, find things outside your day jobs where you can get out and talk to real people. What I found as I got more senior in the public services, I got kind of more and more isolated, more ivory towered, I guess, in an effort, don't get me wrong, in an effort to serve, but yet further and further removed from the people I was trying to help. So find ways to get that ground truth, whether it's out of your job or in it.
I might move to sorry, go ahead, Robert.
I think it's not only our public sector colleagues that have difficulty slowing down and hearing stories of truth. We also have to be careful in the philanthropic sector that we invest in ways that enable people to be able to tell stories and for us to actually hear them and listen properly to them. So I don't think it's only our government colleagues, it's those of us right across many spaces to actually listen with intent and figure out how we invest in ways that reflect the stories that we've been told by the front line. We in the philanthropic sector are sometimes quite proud to talk about how our OPEX is very low, and sometimes that's code for we actually don't have time to listen either. We need to invest, in my opinion, in our opinion at the Trust, in relational grant making and understanding what the issues are that the community want to bring to us. So we can't do that if we behave like FPOS machines. So we also need cultural shift in our organisations as well. And I don't think we should only leave that to our colleagues and friends in government who are driven by some externalities as well.
That's wonderful. We've got questions coming in thick and fast now. So what I'm going to do so that we can move through as many as possible in the next sort of 5 or 10 minutes or so is I'll direct the question to one panelist, and we'll just get one panelist to answer a question so that we can keep moving through. So the next question sort of flows from the previous one, and the Azra has asked that they're wondering what your thoughts are on navigating the transition from sort of the rich and complex and at times messy nature of stories into synthesized insights and actionable recommendations that public sector workers sometimes need. They call it the hegemony of bullet points. John, I'm going to direct this to you. Have you encountered this, and how did you navigate it, is the question.
We encountered it every day. I quite like that phrase. I'm going to use it. But yeah, the medium is often constraining. I want 5 simple dot points, 1 data point. In evaluations, we could get away with maybe a 5-page executive summary or a 10-page, but again, anything longer and people weren't gonna read it. So firstly, in the process, the report talks about ensembles of evidence, that idea that you need to collide evidence from different sources, from different methods, from different disciplines. Often it won't sound like an ensemble ever, if at all, like ever, you know, and I think I've got something in the report talking about that's where the joy is finding those disconnects between what the data says and what story is, and hanging out in that disconnect. In the synthesis of it, being very careful there, because it is too easy to cut something that doesn't fit with an assumption or a narrative. Involving people who have helped in the collection in that synthesis is a really good way of trying to hold true to the story. And then what I found is doing whatever we could to explain complexity, caveats in the report. So nuanced recommendations, nuanced findings, processes, and even the debates we used to have are holding back from a recommendation at times for risk that it would be misinterpreted, and trying to get that process of hanging out more before we jump to a simple solution. But absolutely love the term, and agree that simple decision making is really a real problem that we have to get over.
That's great. Thanks, John. Kerry has asked the question around creating the conditions for people in policy to engage in deeper, long-term and more relational ways. And I know, Daniel, that's a lot of the work that you've been doing. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, how you do this, like how you get people in government to listen differently, to focus more on relationships? Like, what's the work that you've been doing around this?
I think that the stories are compelling. I suppose that's the thing, is making the Mount Yarn stuff went on for many years, and it took it was a lot of hard work, and we did in different mediums. So, you know, we have a little documentary, a 20-minute documentary kind of thing, because our young people are not going to necessarily read a 50-page report. But even our report is a very good looking report, if I want to be truthful about it too. So it's engaging. So, but again, like, it's then about being strategic, about getting into the right people's rooms. I think there is necessarily I think that there is a lot of good people that work within government, and it's just really trying to cut through some of that stuff that John's talking about, like that, getting into a room with one of our young people or with a couple of our young people or them. Uncle Phil up in Burke, I remember him talking about, we wants politicians and the philanthropists and everyone to cross the bridge and come to their side of town rather than always having to go over to the other side, So I think that that's a really good strategy in cutting some of that, because I think that, like anything, a good story can break down a lot of those barriers, and it makes you empathetic and it makes you feel. And so if you can, we've got a bunch of good stories, and it's the good stories doesn't mean they're always happy stories, but they're good stories, And so if we can get into a room with a person that they normally feel that, and they normally react well to that, and have given us support, it's really just getting into those rooms is the hard thing, where it's like, well, we've got this youth-led project here, it's not like the same as we've got 5 dot points on a piece of paper. You can read this while you're walking to Parliament, So we need time with people in power is, I suppose, the thing. And if we have that time, I think we can get those stories across.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. One more question. We probably won't have time quite for all of them. We're almost through them. But Robin, an interesting question that's come up is a question around, do we need education to develop understanding of what listening is, or to develop listening methodologies, and what would that look like in practice for you? So I know that that you have worked both in government and in the philanthropic sector, and have spoken about, when we spoke earlier, you sort of said that you were struck by the incapacity, or maybe not incapacity, inability, unwillingness of people in government to really listen. Is there room for education in this? That was one of the things that came up in the report as well. Can we build those skills? There are cultural shifts that are required, which I've heard you all talk to, and shifts in sort of mindsets and beliefs. Are there also more practical, skills-based processes and practices that we can be introducing as well?
I'm not sure, Thea. I guess that's a pretty hard question. To the comments that Daniel's just made, quite often once you get in front of people, they naturally are moved or will listen to a story and hook into it. I think what's required is a cultural change, as in there's an expectation from leaders and organisations that stories and community-informed stories will be part of policies that are put forward. Some of that's about a cultural shift in an organisation of what you actually value as a leader and what you value your team producing with you, and who gets to talk. We once hosted a forum actually for policymakers and the community, where the Prime Minister actually then became the person who needed to host a panel so that we could get policymakers to come and listen. And unfortunately, a lot of the people that we invited sent along other people who then told us that actually they weren't particularly interested in this thing, but they'd been sent there by somebody. So how do we influence leadership in organisations to make sure that the people in organisations know and understand how important this work is? And I'm not sure whether it's an education piece or it's a values piece. I'm not really sure what the ingredients in making that change are, Thea, but I don't think it happens without a commitment from leaders, really, in organisations to value stories and to value community-informed information for your story.
That feels like a beautiful note to end on. I'm sorry we didn't quite get to all the questions, but I'm going to hand to Rachel now to wrap us up and close the webinar. So thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Thea, and thanks, everyone. I'm Rachel from Dusseldorp Forum, and I just want to start by thanking everyone for attending today. Now that we're at the end of the webinar, I just wanted to wrap up by reflecting on some of what we've heard today and share a bit about what's next. John spoke about the tension between people and their stories and how they interact with the system, as well as the over-reliance on data and its challenges. Daniel spoke about creating safe spaces and trust for stories to be told and heard, and that there is power and truth in collective storytelling and data sovereignty. Robin spoke about elevating the voices of people who are not often heard in mainstream media to challenge negative narratives, and about creating spaces for policy people to really listen to community stories, to understand rather than just to take action. The audience was curious about the time it takes to tell stories well and how we encourage long-term investment in it. Building a culture of storytelling, getting out and talking to real people and getting close to the truth. Philanthropy needs to invest in storytelling, story listening, and more relational giving. How do we synthesize stories into a medium government will listen to? Ensembles of evidence are required, including community and synthesis and reporting with nuance. How do we create environments where policymakers can really hear stories? Inviting policymakers to your place, into your room, to hear the stories in place from the real people. Time with people in power. How do we develop story listening skills? It requires a change in culture and perhaps influencing leadership. The way we like to work together is to take what we've been learning and find the places that might be ready to put some of these elements into practice. Our last storytelling report, Storytelling for Systems Change Insights from the Field, resulted in a series of digital campfires that spread in real life and are a place for exploring storytelling practice as part of a national movement for place-based change in Australia. Today, we'd love to hear your feedback on our story listening work. We're going to use a word cloud. Azitha's going to pop that into the chat for you now. Having listened to today's conversation, what is one idea that felt particularly relevant to you and your work? Pop that into the word cloud and we'll be able to see what's resonating. Az, are you able to share the word cloud once it's in? Yeah. Oh, here it comes. Yeah, nice. Trust is clearly excellent. So I just want to thank you all so much for your interest in the storytelling work the Dusseldorp Forum, Hands Up Mallee and the Centre for Public Impact have been collaborating on for several years now. A very special thanks to Azitha and Thea for leading the work, and to the team at CPI for their support bringing this report together and sharing it with the world. Thank you to Lila from Hands Up Mallee for taking time away from her work on the ground in her community to contribute her storytelling expertise. And to the contributors we heard from during our listening sessions, and especially Daniel, Robin, and John for joining us today to share their insights. We'd love for you to stay connected to our work and love to know what elements from the report you'd like to see come to life. You can do that in two ways. You can sign up to hear more from us or sign up to our community of practice. Both links have been dropped into the chat. We're also extending an invitation to work together with CPI as a learning partner to support you to integrate these practices and mindsets into your work. If this is of interest, please reach out to Azitha, whose email is now in the chat. Again, thank you all so much for attending today, and thanks so much to our panelists. Have a great rest of your day or evening.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks so much.